How's it going, everybody? Looks like we got a couple people in here. So for those of y'all who don't know me, my name's Andy. I work at Mossy Creek Fly Fishing here in Harrisonburg. It used to be over in Orvis in Charlottesville. But we still got a few minutes, so I'm going to get some stuff together, and we will go from there. Sweet. Thanks, Brian. Guys, give me 1 second. I forgot one tool I'm going to need. I'll be right back. All right, sorry about that, y'all. Need the old pen cap. So as we're waiting, if you guys don't have something, I'd recommend getting something cylindrical that can fit over your hook. We'll use that when doing our reverse ties. While we're waiting, I'll go ahead and go over my materials here too. In the vise right now, I'm using the Orvis 6/0 Predator hook. Gotcha, Brian. You could also use some other hooks. This is a Gamakatsu 6/0. I like that a lot, but it's a shorter shank hook, so I can't tie quite as large of a fly on it. But I'll use that a lot of times when I'm using articulated flies. Give it about 1 more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get going here. All right, looks like we got some people coming in now. So we'll give it 1 more second for a few more people to filter in, but As I said before, in case anybody has just joined, we're using a 6/0 Orvis Predator hook. You just want any large hook that you've got. What's going on, Stu? And then the other important thing is very strong thread. If you have anything less than, say, 210 denier or so, you're gonna end up breaking it. I'm using 200 gel spun. And for those of y'all who don't know me and who may have joined just now, my name's Andy. I'm from Mossy Creek. I used to work over at Orvis in Charlottesville, so I know some of y'all, but not every go along. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So I got my hook in the vise here, and just you're going to start by bringing your thread all the way back to about that hook point. And you'll see I've got a really long hook shank here to tie on. So some of y'all, if you don't have this hook, may not have quite as much space. So when we get up here to the head, if you don't have a whole lot of room, just hold off and then join back in as we go to do the head. So we'll start here with bucktail. I'm going to be doing two different colors. We're doing orange and yellow. And to get started here for this back tip of my bucktail, so I'm grabbing from up here. These bottom hairs here are much more hollow. We want the ones up top so that they're not going to splay quite as much and they're not going to want to spin quite as much. So I'll just go ahead and get a little clump here. I don't know, maybe about a pencil's thickness. Hopefully y'all can see that. Brian's asking about color selection. So it's hard to say. I think that color selection is definitely pretty important. You know, a lot of people ask me all the time in the shop, what color flies should we be throwing today? What color streamer? And it's not always a question that you can easily answer, but you know, when we look at weather, that's going to be a big thing. So if you're out and it's a real cloudy day, we're going to fish darker flies typically. If it's a bright sunny day, the water's clear, you're going to want to go to something maybe like this, like an orange and yellow, or something white, something brighter in color. Hopefully that answers your question. And y'all see I'm using green thread. I did not check to see what I had, but that's all right. One nice thing about these flies is they're messy, and that's okay. So on this first tie in here, we're just going to do it regular. We're going to tie that hair in just facing backwards. And I'm going to hold my material here, my bucktail, with my left hand and get a couple loose wraps on there. So I'll get 3. And then I'm just going to pull and hold that material. I'm going to pull with my bobbin and get that material nicely secured to the hook. I'll do a couple more wrap throughs there. And I really just want to make sure that this material is solid on the hook and it doesn't want to keep spinning. So keep going, get as many wraps as you need on there until it's steady. If you need to, you can come up and wrap through some of these fibers. I'm not going to because my bucktail is behaving nicely for me. So we'll just leave it right there. And then you'll come in here with your scissors, and it doesn't have to be really neat, but we're just going to cut off some of these extra fibers here. All right. And so we're tying this in really as something to prop up what's going to be most of our tail. And for that, we're going to use nice long saddle feathers. So this that I have, these are a little bit more expensive. If you don't have one of these, you can use just your little extra long saddle Hackle patches that you can get, you know, for $10 as opposed to 50 here. But these are really nice. They're really long feathers, so we can make a really long tail out of them. And these we're going to tie a whole bunch in. There's no specific number to it. I'm going to go ahead and tie in probably 4, so I'll do 2 on each side. And I'll try and just tie it so you guys can see here. But we'll get 1 tied in right in that same spot. So we're tying everything in where we tied that bucktail in at this point. And then, and these feathers also don't need to all be the same length. They can be off a little bit. If you really like to have things precise, go for it. But I don't think it really matters in terms of the actual fishing of the fly. So we'll get a second one tied on there. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. These are going to move like crazy in the water, and they're going to go all over the place. So it doesn't matter a whole lot how perfect you get them on there. And we're going to keep tying in more as we go through this fly. That'll make more sense later, but they'll build on top of each other. That's kind of how everything in this fly is. It's going to build as it goes. So we're not going to use a whole lot of material at any point, but as we build through this, all that material is going to keep building on top of itself. And by the end of it, you've got the And as y'all can see here, I'm tying in just on the complete opposite side. So we're tying down both sides of the hook here. I'll get one more in here. All right. So now we've got most of our tail formed here. We're going to go ahead and tie in some flash. I think I'll use some saltwater Flashabou here. So this is just, you can use any, and for this tie-in, I'm going to tie my flash so that it's going to come back just about where these feathers are ending. So, and these ones I'll tie in directly on top of the hook here as well. And still we're tying in at that same exact spot. So Brian asked about what kind of fish we're using this fly for. So this fly specifically was designed for pike and muskie, but you can certainly fish for any sort of predator fish. So any fish that eats another fish is going to want to eat this kind of fly. This size that we're doing here is going to be more of a muskie or pike size fly, but people catch huge largemouth, huge smallmouth all the time on these. But you could certainly size it down and use like one of these hooks here. It's a much shorter shank. Really, the shank is where you're going to get all your length on the body from. So if you size down your shank, you're going to get a smaller fly profile by the end of it. But yeah, any fish that is a predator will eat this kind of fly. And so I've got that flash tied in coming to the back, and I have this extra material hanging out the front. If you already cut it, that's fine. Don't worry about it. But I go ahead and just fold that back and add that into the clump. Because, again, we're going to be tying in more flash later. So it's completely fine to have your flash ending at a few different spots. All right. So now we got the back of that fly done. And wherever you are on the shank of your hook now, just bring your thread up to the next area of bare hook shank. That's going to make it, we're going to now start to spin some of our bucktail. And if you've got a lot of material on top, then it's going to be really hard to get that bucktail to spin. And so at this point, you could switch bucktail colors if you want. I'm going to stick with the same color for these first two, and then I'll start alternating as we go through. And so for these clumps, we're going to do about the same size. We really don't want it super, super thick because, like I said, it's going to build on top of each other. So there's how much I'm grabbing. Hard to see, I know, but I'd say maybe a 1/4 inch thick or so. Again, people always say about a pencil's thickness, if that helps you. And I'll come in and cut that off right at the base. And now material management can be hard here. So you're switching hands. So I keep it pinched and just come in with my fingers and transfer that and then get it back so I'm holding on top. And now you guys have seen Brian do this, I know, in his topwater frog video. We're just going to come in. I don't have a brush with me, but just get out all these little fibers at the back like that. And now we're going to do what's called a reverse tie. So I'm not sure if any of y'all have seen this, so I'll try to talk you through it. So we're actually going to tie this material in backwards from how you normally did. So reverse of what we did back here. So for that, I'm going to turn this material in my hands. So now I've got the tips pointing towards the eye of the hook. And I'm going to try and even them out a little bit here. It's hard to get it perfect. But we're going to come and lay that so it's just overlapping past those wraps. So our wraps are ending right about here. So are the butt ends of these fibers. And I'll transfer that to my left hand. And now this part can be tricky, but I'll try my best to talk you all through it. We're going to do 1 loose wrap, 2 loose wraps, 3 loose wraps. And then right here, we're going to pull and spin this material, and you'll see it'll flare out. And you got to put a good bit of pressure on it as you do it. And you'll see I actually have a little bit of a bare spot here, so that's no problem. What I do before I get this material too tight is I check. I want this covering the whole hook. So I'm going to take my fingers and just sort of work that material rose to it. Again, this is going to build on top of itself, so it's not the end of the world if you can't get it perfect. But once I've got it spread out pretty well, we're going to do a few more locking wraps, really putting some good pressure on this bucktail to get it tight. Yeah, absolutely, Steve. I've actually fished this in saltwater myself a few times. Actually, 4-striper. I did a chartreuse and white version and did really well on it. So now all this material is pushing forwards. We're going to take our pen cap. That's what I'm using. They do make materials or tools for this, but pen cap works great, so no need to go out and buy something expensive. If you want to, great. They work a little bit better, but I get away with this just fine. And now we're just going to push that material back until it's going backwards over all the rest of the material. And so then what I'm going to do is come in here while the pen's still holding it back and try and grab all of those materials, all of the bucktail, and gather all of that. I've got one extra one there. Okay, so now on the back part of this fly, oh, I guess I lied. I used yellow. I told you guys I was going to use orange, but that's okay. But on right here where your thread is, you'll see it's right behind the front of this reverse. So a lot of people you'll see they'll bring their thread in front at that point and build up. I don't like to do that in the back of this fly because if you think of a fish, they're thick in the middle typically, and then they taper at the back. So what I'm going to do instead is do a wrap right back there and pull tight. And that way, this isn't going to flare quite as much as it would. And it's a really easy way to grab all that material and get the fly starting to look how you want it to. So you'll see already how much this hair is flaring. So you can imagine as we build through, we're going to have a lot of material here that's going to push through the water. And now from this point on, what we're pretty much going to do is reverse tie like this, and then we're going to add more feathers and more flash, and the whole fly is going to build on top of itself. And for these feathers, I typically go a little bit shorter. So you can see this one, when I tie it in, is not going to go all the way to the back. But again, it's, like I said, building up on top of itself as we go. So here I'm just going to tie one feather in on each side, and we're going to tie it in the same spot right where our thread is sitting. And this method also helps keep the front of my shank here really nice and exposed, so that way my spinning is going to be much easier. I won't have a bunch of material sitting underneath of it. So we'll come in here, get this on, and then I'll get one more feather for the other side. And these, again, don't need to be exactly the same length or anything. If you're a perfectionist, go for it, but I don't think that they fish any different. All right. So now I'm going to tie in some more flash. I'm going to change it up. Last time I used an orange Flashabou. This time I'm going with just your typical like saltwater mirage pearl type Flashabou. And when I cut this, guys, I'm not using a ton of flash, maybe 3, 4, 5 strands at the most. You really don't need to use a whole lot of this stuff. And we're going to do this one a little bit differently. We're going to try and do half on one side and half on the other, but kind of on the top side of the hook still a little bit. So I'll try and do this so you guys can see. So there's the top of the fly right here. And I'm going to tie that first clump in, just right up there. And then I'll grab this excess and try to bring it to the other side and wrap over that stuff. And then we'll do a few good wraps to lock everything in place. And I mean, you guys can probably see already how much this fly is building on itself. And we're just going to keep doing this up the rest of the shank of the hook here. So we'll come forward again to our next position. And this time I will switch to my orange bucktail. And we're going to go ahead and grab about that same amount of material. Again, about a pencil's thickness. And we'll go ahead and get that reversed. And we'll do this reverse tie the same as the last. So I want my butt ends to just cover up what I did on my last wrap. And that's going to help too with durability. So I'm covering up these threads. If you really want these flies to be extremely durable, I'd go ahead and put super glue at every single reverse tie that you do. But I don't find that I need to do that really. So again, for this spin, we'll do 1, 2, 3 loose wraps. And then as I pull, I'll keep spinning and I'll really put some pressure on this. And I'm going to take my fingers, just make sure everything is spread out relatively evenly. What's going on, Jeff? How you doing, man? Jeff, I expect to see a perfectly tied fly on Instagram after this, by the way. All right, and so now that I've got my material spread out, I'm going to do a couple locking wraps here. And get your pen cap. And again, we'll push that backwards, covering up the back of the hook, or covering the material backwards. And we'll do the same thing here. Yeah, that might be a little tough, Jeff. And we'll get that stuff all locked in pretty tight there. All right. And here's one beautiful thing about these flies, guys. If something's not perfect, it always gets covered up. So I'm glad I did this because I can show you all. You see how my material hadn't spread quite enough? You can still see that thread coming through. What I'm going to do is tie in my feather, and it's going to just perfectly block that. So we'll tie that in right there, and you won't hardly even be able to tell. And the fish certainly won't be able to tell. Yeah, that's right, Jeff. No excuses. And again, we'll get another feather on the other side here. So yeah, you can see that that feather there covered up my mistake. And as I tie more in, it's just going to get covered up even more. So now I'll do some more flash. I'm going to change it up again. This time I'm going to use a little copper orange crystal flash. Yeah, and Brian said it perfectly. The beauty of these big flies is they do not need to be perfect at all. You know, when the fish see these things moving through the water, if they want to eat it, they're going to come and eat it. They're not going to inspect it. It's not like a dry fly sitting on the surface being inspected by a trout moving along slowly. These fish, when they see it, they're opportunistic and they grab that opportunity quick and will eat it, you know, without a second look. So you don't need it to be perfect at all. And actually, funny enough, with these flies, half the times the ones that I tie that look the worst actually fish the best, because they'll swim in all different directions, and the fish kind of go crazy for that. Oh, sorry about that, Stu. Good to see you, though, man. Hope you're getting out on the water. But we'll come forward here to the next section, and we'll do the same thing again. This time I'll grab my yellow bucktail. And we'll go ahead and do another reverse tie here. So we'll get that material turned around. Again, a couple loose wraps, and go ahead and get that material to spin nicely around that hook. And then do a few locking wraps, really getting that tight. And I find it helps to really brace the hook. So I grab, you guys probably see, I grab the hook with my left hand and pull with the bobbin on my right. Otherwise, I get a lot of movement in the hook like that. And we'll go ahead and reverse these materials here. And we'll do the same thing again. Just grabbing that material from right where you are. Giving a few tight wraps to get that material to splay out. And if you guys ever do it and the material is going a little bit more wild than you want it to, one trick for that is do a few loose wraps coming backwards and then come back forwards and then tighten down. And you'll see that made my material not much, but come back a little bit more at a 45-degree angle or so, keeping everything a little bit neater and more together. But at this point, like before, grab a few more feathers. And we'll tie those in on the sides here. I'm going to go a little bit longer with my feathers here. So now I'm going to try and have these sort of overlapping towards all the back. The other thing I'm going to do is, as I build up a little bit closer to my head here, is I'm going to start to tie these feathers in more on the top side of the hook. These darker feathers are going to just try and kind of make that dark back that a lot of bait fish have. So we'll do one on one side and one on the other. Trim off the excess here. And now we'll tie in some flash. And I'll come back to what we started with here, this orange flash of Vu. But again, you guys can use any flash you have. Makes no difference at all. And now I'm tying this flash in also on top of that hook, like that. Got a few of these going crazy, but that's all right. And we'll go back to our orange bucktail now. Grab one more section of this. Everybody doing all right? Anybody have any questions or anything at this point? Nice thing about this fly is once you learn how to do these reverse ties, there's really not a whole lot to them. You know, and that's a good pattern to use. You could tie one of these. Brian and I were talking about it earlier today, actually, a really small version, and go trout fishing with it. But we'll take this, flip it over, try and even out those ends a little bit. Do the same thing as before. Get that material so it's just going to cover up the last spot. Oh, and I forgot to move my thread forward. And we'll do 1, 2, 3 loose wraps, and then twist that material around the hook. And I'll use my fingers to help it out a little bit here. Jeff, I feel for you, buddy. That's all I can say. This is the time of existential questioning for sure. All right. So we'll just reverse tie this one again, the same as before. I know it's a little bit repetitive, but we're getting close to the end of this fly here, and the head will be a little bit different. All right, so guys, this presents a situation I run across occasionally. So this bucktail is a little bit slick, and as I pull tight, my material or my thread wants to jump forward on the hook. So what I can do then, if that's happening, is come in with my scissors, and some of this extra that's back here, I'm going to cut down. Grab some sharper scissors here. Trying not to cut those fibers that are coming forward, only the ones going backwards. And let's see here. Now if I try to do it, I've got a little less bulk there, so this should grab a little better. Yep, there we go. Perfect. If you've got a few fibers coming forward, don't worry about it. Just come in and trim those off. All right, and as before, we will tie in some more feathers and some more flash. And guys, depending on what hook you have, like I said, if you're getting up towards the end of your hook shank here, take a pause. You're going to want to save about, I don't know, maybe a quarter to a half of an inch in order to tie that head in. And Brian asked a good question here. Would we ever add weight to this fly? So, Brian, I will occasionally. and the only reason I'm doing that is to try and have this fly orient in a certain way. So, for instance, if I'm tying a head where, because we can change the heads on these flies. If I'm tying a head, or maybe I have eyes on it, and I want the hook to ride a certain direction, then I'll add weight either on the top of the hook if I want it to flip and ride a hook point up, or I'll add weight to the bottom to ensure that it will ride hook point down. I don't really like to add a lot of weight to these because it's a big fly already, so it's really it can be a pain to cast on lighter weight fly rods because of the air resistance. And then if we add weight into the picture, it gets even harder. But the nice thing about these is they don't really soak up hardly any water, so they're not going to be super heavy, which you know, some other materials like say craft fur would soak up tons of water, and it would end up being extremely heavy to cast. You know, and those kinds of flies, then if you're adding weight, it can get crazy. But long story short, I occasionally will add weight, but not very often. So yeah, feathers, here we go. And again, guys, we're just going to do one feather on each side here. And you'll see one thing that these feathers kind of do is build a little bit of a lateral line down the side of the fly. You know, so that can give it a little bit more realistic presentation. Speaking of lateral lines too, part of the reason that this fly works so well is, I mean, as you guys can see, if you look at this, we've got a pretty wide fly. So as this thing moves through the water, all of this is going to be coming in contact with the water itself, and it's going to push it. And fish, especially predator fish, have this unique ability to pick up vibrations and movement in the water through their lateral lines. So this is a great searching pattern because those fish are going to know that there's something in the area and there's something moving, swimming through the water, and that's going to trigger them to want to follow it and check it out and hopefully end up eating it. Add a little bit more flash in here. And we're doing this flash the same way as before. And I'll just get a couple or more wraps on there, make sure everything's nice and secure. Bring my thread forward again. And so we're probably going to get one or two more reverse ties on here. I want to save plenty of room to make a nice big bulky head. That's where a lot of this bulk from this fly is going to come from. So we go back to our yellow bucktail here. And you could use a hair stacker and stuff like that if you guys want to. One thing I'll do is if my fibers aren't aligned, I just kind of gently press it against my other hand a couple times. And that helps me get the majority of these feathers or these this bucktail together. So again, we'll line it up here. We'll get a couple loose wraps on there and go ahead and spin that material right around the hook. And if anybody out there is struggling with that spin, you just got to keep practicing. The most important thing is putting enough pressure on your thread to make that want to go. You want to have a pretty bare hook shank, and then make sure you're letting go with your other hand, because if you hold on, that material is going to stay right where it is. So you want to make sure that you're letting go and pulling pretty tight to really flare and to really spin that material. I'm just doing a little bit more wraps on this one to kind of help corral this material into position here. All right, that'll work. And we'll do some more feathers and some more flash, in case anybody couldn't have guessed that one. And guys, you could change up your feather color too if you want. I really like this saddle hackle that I have here, so that's why I'm sticking with it. But feel free to play around and mess with different colors throughout this entire fly. We'll do one last little clump of flash here. All right, getting close to the end. We'll do one last reverse tie, and then we're going to go ahead and start on the head. Now, I'm going to do my head in orange. So because I'm going to be switching to that for my last area for my head, I'm going to do another tie-in of yellow for this one. Try and go through this one a little bit quicker for y'all so you don't have to watch the same thing over and over again here. Right, now we'll do the last bit of feathers here. And for these last two, I do typically a shorter feather, kind of to act as almost like a fin up at the front. And I'm going to tie this one in so that you can see the feathers curved. I want that curve facing out. And that, like I said, is just kind of going to look like a little fin, or perhaps to the fish. Looks nice, at least to the tyer. Whether it makes a difference to the fish or not, probably not. and we'll do one last little bit of flash, and then we'll be moving on to the head of this fly. And again, you guys can see I'm not precise with any of this really at all. You really don't need to be. It's one of the beauties of tying flies like this. And so now I've left myself ample room here to tie a nice thick head. If you don't have quite as much room as me, that's fine. You're just gonna have a little bit smaller of a head. Sometimes I'll tie them that way. But I do prefer to have a nice thick head section here because that, like I said, is going to push a lot of the water. All right, so for my head, I'm going to tie it in orange, like I said. And one thing to point out, guys, I know Brian's talked about this before, I believe, with his deer hair bugs. And I mentioned it earlier, but the bucktails, the material down at the base of your bucktail is much more hollow, and therefore it wants to spin a lot more. And then the material up here, not quite as much. So I really like to use this material down here to build the head of my fly. We're going to do a lot of spinning here, and we're trying to get a nice thick amount on the hook. So I save this typically for the heads of the flies. And for this, we are going to grab more than we typically would. Grab as much as you can comfortably hold and be able to tie with. So I'm grabbing about this much, maybe 2 pencils widths if you want to think of it that way. But just do as much as you can hold. Brian's asked if you would ever use deer belly hair. You certainly could, absolutely. I don't, just because I've got the bucktail sitting here. Really, that's the only reason. But you definitely could. So if anybody has that, feel free to use it. I definitely would like to use bucktail on this first part of my head because this long bucktail is still going to be building into the back, whereas the material up at the front is going to be what builds my head. And Steve, to answer your question about the minimum rod weight, for a fly of this size right here, 9 weight probably is about right. You could probably cast this somewhat on an 8 weight, but it's going to be pretty difficult. But you can size the fly up or down for the kind of rod that you're using. So, you know, if you're going to be fishing with an 8 weight, you might want to go a little bit smaller, you know, or you could go a lot smaller and tie this on like, you know, a size 2 hook for fishing, say largemouth or smallmouth, or even in the salt too. But for this first tie-in, we're going to leave all of this feather or all this bucktail together, and I'm going to lay the tips back, so we're no longer reverse tying. We're going back to regular, and I'm going to measure about how long I want my head. So whatever material I tie in going forward is what's going to become my head. So I like to keep that maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches. We're going to trim it at the end, so it's not an exact science, but less trimming the closer you get. So I've got that held there with the tips facing backwards and the butt ends coming forward about 1 inch or so. We're going to do basically the same thing here. I'm going to get a couple loose wraps. Let me get a little more bob in use here. And then we're going to go to spin this. And now I'm a little far. But as we spin it and pull tight, you can see how much that material wanted to spin. And that was because I grabbed it from the base of my bucktail. And then again, we can kind of work this with our fingers, and I'm going to push back as I do this. That's one way to build up a really dense head, is pushing these fibers back. You know, really want to make sure you got your hook secure in your vise, because I have popped it clean out of my vise plenty of times pushing back too hard. And then just really make sure that stuff's secure. Wrap through it a few times. Make sure you're not getting any more spin out of it. And then I'll take my pen cap here and push those fibers back. Try and grab them all. This part can be a little tricky, but you just have to get used to working with your hands in this way, and then bring your thread forward. Give it a couple wraps right there. But we're not going to do a whole lot. So you'll see all these fibers are sticking about straight up right now. And so then we'll come in here and we'll grab another nice thick clump from the base of our bucktail. And this time we're going to do it a little bit differently. So I want this bucktail to be the same length as this head is right now. So I'm going to kind of grab on, get your short materials out, but I'm going to measure it so I know right about there is where I want to cut, right about here. So that'll be in line. Again, we're going to trim this at the end. So if you're not exact, do not worry about it. Sharp scissors help, which mine are getting a little dull. But there we go. So what I've got now is a nice clump of bucktail. Both ends are trimmed. Nothing precise. You can see I've got a bunch of little stray fibers. That's okay. Not a big deal. What I'm going to do now is kind of pull back on what I've tied in, place my hair on there. And this part, again, can be a little bit difficult getting used to. But it just takes playing around with it a little bit. Try and get a nice hold on there. Come over your material a few times, 3 loose wraps, and then we'll go ahead and spin that. Get that nice and tight. I'm bracing the hook with my other hand as I pull, and I'm really putting a lot of force into this. I want to get all the spin out of that. And then I'll grab my pen cap, and I'll start to work that back. And you guys can see right now, if you look, it looks like I'm starting to get really close to the end of this, like I don't have much room left. I'm going to take my thumb and pointer, holding onto the hook, push back a couple times, and it'll really open up the amount of space that I've got, and it'll push all those fibers nice and tight together. And we'll go ahead and bring our thread through that one more time. And we'll grab one more clump. I think we'll probably get one last one on here. You might be able to get 2, but I want to save some room to kind of build up the head with my thread and make sure I've got a good solid tie-off point in this fly. And again, I'm going to get all my short fibers out of here. So I'll hold back on the clump, get all that stuff out. If you don't do this, your material is not going to want to spin near as much. And I'll measure again. Try and get close. The closer you get on this, the less trimming you have to do at the end. But it's not a huge deal if they're different sizes. You just want to be close. And we'll go ahead and get this material on and spin it. Don't pull too tight. You'll do what I just did and cut through some of your material. So be careful with that. This gel spun thread is almost unbreakable. I mean, if you break it, then I don't know what you're doing, but you're stronger than me. And again, I'm going to push that stuff back as much as I can, get all the movement. Go ahead, and at this point, since I don't have a ton of shank left, I might be able to get one more section on there, but I'm going to go ahead and tie this off. But first, I'm going to build up my thread right at the eye and try to do it so you guys can see, but the way I have to hold this material kind of blocks. But we'll just build this up a little bit, coming forward and going backwards. You'll see I'm losing a few materials here and there. Yeah, Steve, certainly not one you want to lose in the rocks. That is right. I have done it plenty of times, and it hurts. You should see the lengths that I go to get it back. Yeah, like Brian just said, this is the kind you dive in after. Now, luckily with these, typically they happen. You don't need to, you're not going to break off the fly typically. You can go over, get different angles on it and everything. All right, but so that's basically the end of this. We still have to trim it, but I'll go in and whip finish here. Oh, trapped a few fibers there. Hang on. If you trap 1 or 2 fibers on the whip finish, that's totally fine. But if you accidentally grab a whole clump like I did there, make sure you try and get that out. And I'm doing the whip finish with my hand here, but you guys do it however you feel comfortable. If you have trouble whip finishing, feel free to just go in and put a couple of half hitches on there. But just make sure you get that head nice and secure. You spend a lot of time on the fly, so you want to make sure that you finish it pretty well. Then I'll come in here, a couple of fibers that I'd trapped, I'll go ahead and cut loose. All right, so that's basically it. And you could go out and fish this fly as it is right now, but I like to come in and clean these heads up. And it's not like, say, a CK bait fish or a deer hair frog, where you have to get it really neat. Again, you certainly can, but like Brian said before, that's more for catching the fisherman than it is the fish. So the way I like to trim these is first I'll look at the head on, and I might cut off 1 or 2 that are coming out that I don't like the look of. But what I mainly do is I look, and if you see, if I grab here, and you could put a rubber band on, but if I push down on this fly, I've got all my head material right here. And so I'll pick my shortest tie-in and base my cuts kind of off of scissors up behind it. And I don't know if, I hope y'all can see this, but I'm kind of bringing my material forward. We're going to do a little bit at first, cut straight across the top here. You can always go back and add me in my vise spins. If you don't have one, you'll have to kind of work your scissors around it, but I like to just turn it. And again, I'll come in here and try to line that cut up about the same. And cut this one straight too. We're kind of going to cut a square at first, and then we'll go in and we'll round it off to be nice and circular. Yep, Brian, exactly. We're cutting a square first, and then we're going to come in and take off the edges and turn it into a circle. And look at it from all different angles. So if you're just looking like straight on, come around and look at it from the front, spin it and look at it. It doesn't have to be perfect again, but I like to try my best. So now what I'll come in and do is any corners that I've created, I'm just going to come in and kind of trim those up a little bit. start to make my head nice and circular. Ooh, watch your fingers. And you could sit here and trim all day, but that's about good for me. Make a few more cuts here. All right. There you guys have it. That is the single Buford. So there's kind of how your head should look. You see mine's not a perfect circle by any means. From the side, you can see it's tapered a little bit, kind of pushed back. If yours is perfectly flat, that's fine. But, you know, there you've got maybe 7, 8-inch fly. You can add a lot of length in the tail, obviously. The nice thing about these, you've only got one hook, and it's way up here. So some of y'all might think, what happens if the fish comes and eats it like this? They're not going to get hooked. Well, predator fish typically like to grab a bait fish from the side like that. And so you could tie in a trailer hook back here if you wanted to, but it really doesn't tend to be an issue. They're going to come and hit it hard from the side, and they're going to get hooked a lot, 99% of the time on that hook. But yeah, guys, that's about it. I'll show you real quick here. There's also, if you wanted to, this is a single Buford. We've got one hook. It's a single Buford, but you could continue those reverse ties all the way up to the end of the hook here, and then attach one of these shanks, and that way you've got an articulated fly. So, you know, those might have a little bit more motion, but these are going to run in the water really nicely, even on one hook shank here. So anybody have any questions here before we sign off? Thank you guys for letting me come on and tie with y'all. Hope everybody learned at least something. Sorry if I was all over the place. Like I said, I'm new to this live stream stuff, but if anybody's got any questions that I don't get to on here, feel free to text Brian, and he can get in contact with me. You can call over to Mossy Creek if you want. I work there most days, so I'd be happy to answer any questions for y'all. But again, thanks for having me. And I guess we'll go ahead and end it there. Thank you all. Have a good night.